My name is Jen Bair, and I am one of the co-organizers of Network O, the SASE network on global value chains, along with Cornelia Steritz and Rory Horner, both of whom are here today, and also Matt Alford, who I think is not able to join us for the session. So we're really delighted to have the opportunity to convene this virtual session, especially since the three of us are not able to make it to Brazil. So this is our treat in terms of having an experience of the 2023 SASE. And we've been really delighted with the vibrancy of the Network O kind of conversations, both during the SASE meetings, and I also want to put a plug in for our webinar series. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to check that out and to be sure to sign up for those events as well. So our next paper is going to be from Su-Yen Jeon from the University of Virginia, and her paper is entitled Divergent Paths Crossing: How South Korea and Argentina Navigate Global Regulatory Landscape in the Knowledge Economy Era. So Sue, over to you.
Thank you, Jen, for the introduction. Let me just quickly share screen. Can everyone see this? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'll be presenting a portion of my ongoing book project entitled Divergent Paths Crossing: How South Korea and Argentina Navigate Global Regulatory Landscape in the Knowledge Economy Era. Due to the time limit, I'll be presenting a condensed version of the research, but I'll be happy to elaborate on any of the points during the Q&A session. For the most part of the 20th century, the understanding of development has more or less been industrialization, especially how to expand the manufacturing base of a country in order to sort of catch up with the other more so-called advanced economies. And in this, East Asia and Latin America have been frequently compared and contrasted in terms of their different development pathways and outcomes. The existing literature often argues the regional distinctions come from due to the initial factor endowments, historical legacy, geopolitical linkages, sources of foreign aid, among many of other different reasons. The developmental state theory has been an important literature that explains how effective and strategic state intervention can lead to development of selected industry, as it was evidenced by East Asia's successful outcomes during the, sorry, I guess that was the, so developmental state theory was sort of the evidence of how East Asia's successful outcome was sort of based upon. And the strategic role of the state, especially East Asia's embrace of export-oriented industrialization, when many Latin American countries adopted the import substitution model, has often been cited as an important factor that distinguished between the experiences of the two regions. But since the late 1990s, there has been a fundamental shift in how resources are allocated and how economic growth can be achieved. As we enter this so-called knowledge economy or knowledge intensive era, there has been a consensus in the literature that contemporary development can no longer be just about industrialization, because the returns from manufacturing are much lower compared to those in the past. And at the same time, innovation and upgrading have become key preconditions for development. And so what that means is the role of the developmental state has been reconfigured and reconstituted, partly because the global political economic landscape has changed in ways that make it more difficult for states to use the tools that they used to incorporate to facilitate domestic industrialization. At the same time, after the financial crisis in the late 1990s in East Asia and also early 2000 in Latin America, there has been a great deal of changes that have constrained the power of states in recent decades. So the questions I explore in this research are, what does successful development entail in a knowledge-intensive economy? And what does that mean for states that are trying to support developmental processes, and for the firms that in those countries that are attempting to join the global economy? And I try to answer these questions through the analysis of the pharmaceuticals industry in South Korea and the agribiotech sector in Argentina. So the final comparison question I have is, to what extent have the experiences of East Asia and Latin America converged in the knowledge economy era? So as you can see here, compared to the industrial-based economy, knowledge-intensive sectors such as pharmaceuticals or agribiotech, which I'm going to show very shortly, are characterized by greater segmentation, which involves a variety of actors, such as firms, labs, and regulatory bodies across various regions. And due to the nature of how knowledge is produced today, we need to pay greater attention to how domestic innovation is impacted by global market forces. The examples that I'm using here to demonstrate the stakeholders are based mostly from either multinational companies or from the Argentine companies or Argentine government bodies. So the names are mostly from Argentina, just so you know. GVC literature has been arguing that it's important to think of the developmental opportunities in terms of where there is a possibility for insertion into the competition through GVC. And within the GVC scholarship, a group of scholars has been arguing that latecomer states have been precisely doing this by performing the role of facilitator, regulator, or buyer or seller. And among different roles played by states, in frontier technology sectors, the domain where contemporary developmental state can practically influence is the regulatory arena. And also, value generation in knowledge-intensive sectors is so closely intertwined with various forms of rules, such as patents and what's also known as market exclusivity, which is slightly different from patents because that are often provided by the regulatory body instead of the patent office. And I'm happy to elaborate more on it if you have any questions about market exclusivities. So I argue that development today means learning to navigate what I term the global regulatory chain, which is an intertwined set of regulatory measures that span across the borders and impacts various stages of the production processes. And I compose this concept by bridging the three aforementioned literatures, the updated versions of the developmental state theory, the GVC framework, and the regulation and governance literature. Now, I'm certainly not the first one to argue how important the state's role as a regulator is and how the knowledge economy era is characterized by expansion of regulation rather than the opposite. But I think my line of argument makes an important contribution in that I explore how latecomer states and firms other than countries with big domestic economies, such as China or India, overcome the global regulatory hurdles that were already established by multinational companies and their home countries that tend to dominate the ownership of intellectual property rights. And the way that latecomers navigate the global regulatory chain really depends on the niches they find within different stages of their respective value chain. And I do this by using a mix of qualitative methods. So between 2019 and 2021, I conducted 98 in-depth interviews with key stakeholders in the Korean pharmaceuticals industry and the Argentine agribiotech sector. I also supplement the interview data with short-term observations, as well as other relevant secondary data analysis. Here, the left side is the number of interviews I conducted in Korea, and the right side is data from Argentina. So some of the key findings about how latecomer states navigate the global regulatory chain are that states broadly focus on the three stages within the value chain, such as the R&D, manufacturing, and distribution stages. And they use various regulatory means to support domestic firms to learn to overcome regulatory hurdles in the competitive foreign markets. So in the case of the South Korean pharmaceutical industry, at the R&D stage, states would participate in the drafting of global regulatory rules so that they can gain international recognition and acceptance. So for instance, South Korean regulatory bodies are active members of international organizations such as World Health Organization, or it is very long, full acronym. It's called International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, which is also known as ICH. And so these, the Korean regulatory bodies would often participate in those workshops that, that these international organizations can conduct. And so based on their experience in approving those, some of the drugs at home, they would provide or they would help drafting of the pharmaceutical guidelines at the international level. For the manufacturing stage, states would emphasize quality control by modifying domestic regulation to increase stringency as a way to prepare firms for international markets. And at the distribution stage, states would provide indirect subsidies to help domestic firms to sort of better negotiate their prices at the global level. But the extent to which the government provides some of these financial incentives depends on the type of drug or type of drug product. There tends to be greater support for drugs such as biosimilars, which is a sort of follow-on drugs compared to the innovative biopharmaceutical drugs, which Korean firms tend to be known for. And so the government will help sort of or provide financial incentives in order for biosimilar firms to sort of better negotiate their prices at the foreign markets that they enter. Just to note, unlike the US where manufacturers tend to determine the price, I think in Korea and many other countries around the world where they tend to have universal healthcare system, the government is the ultimate decider of drug prices. And so the state tends to manage all these pricing mechanisms through various types of price regulations. The case of the Argentine agrobiotech industry is somewhat similar at the R&D stage, in that Argentina's regulatory body called CONABIA has been recognized by the Food and Agriculture Organization, also known as FAO, as a reference center for the biosafety of genetically modified organisms. And so CONABIA provides technical and scientific advice to other regulatory bodies in the same region, such as other South American countries, as well as other member countries of FAO, such as Africa and Southeast Asia. I would say a key difference is at the distribution stage. So compared to most other genetically modified organism or GMO producing countries, which typically assesses the health and the environmental risk associated with GMOs, Argentina has an additional step called the market evaluation stage. And basically, this requirement is to assess the compatibility of a new GMO with the standards of Argentina's trading partners, so that there's no cross-contamination between conventional type of food products and GMOs. And so if a particular GMO was not approved by foreign regulators, it may well be rejected in Argentina. And this was in fact the case of Argentina's genetically modified wheat, which was first ever developed in the whole world by Argentina's domestic company, but it has stumbled upon a regulatory process for several years. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the following slides. In the case of latecomer firms, the way they navigate the global regulatory chain varies depending on the structure of the relevant market and who their competitors are. So for instance, when the market for a product is relatively new and emerging, and there is no generally accepted regulatory model, firms try to take the so-called first mover advantage so that they can hold on to some period of market exclusivity after they launch their products. In the case where the market is relatively settled and there are clear pre-existing regulatory guidelines, firms would opt for what we call regulatory arbitrage. But the notion of regulatory arbitrage that firms apply in my case sort of differs from typical notion of regulatory arbitrage that are often used in such thing as like tax havens, because in this particular frontier technology sector's case, firms tend to apply for regulatory approval in more challenging rather than easier settings, often associated so that they can launch their products in other less competitive markets more easily thereafter. In other words, based on what I observed, the purpose of regulatory arbitrage that these latecomer firms undertake has more to do with achieving their long-term goals, such as expansion of market, more so than the short-term profits that they can accrue from getting the approval in those countries. So for instance, South Korean pharmaceutical firms that develop new and innovative drugs sometimes opt for US regulatory bodies, which is known to be the most competitive in the pharmaceutical world, even before they will get the approval from the home regulatory body. And the reason behind obviously is so that getting the approval from the FDA could potentially open up greater opportunities in other regions. In the case of Argentina's agribiotech firm, however, they chose the Brazilian market first because Brazil is known to be the biggest importer of Argentina's wheat. But even after getting the approval from Brazil, which also took about 3 or 4 years, the Argentine GM wheat still has not been really commercialized because it has not gained sufficient recognition worldwide. And there continues to be this anxiety about its potential risk to health. This situation sort of raises a counterfactual question as to if this Argentine firm opted to apply for its first regulatory approval in the US instead of Brazil, might this have led to any change in either the process or the results? In fact, the firm that has applied for the regulatory approval for Brazil or gained the approval, they began to apply approval at the US FDA and also USDA in recent years. And so we'll have to see if green light from the US regulatory body may take any or may make any difference in the coming years. So to quickly sum up, the 3 important points I wanted to make in this presentation are, first, we need more analysis on industry-specific characteristics so that they can better formulate development-related policies today. And secondly, the global regulatory chain model that I talked about during the presentation can potentially help states and firms to better understand different regulatory hurdles that are posed at different stages of a value chain so that they can overcome those challenges more effectively and strategically. Finally, even though we have seen some level of similarities as to how latecomers in both East Asia and Latin America navigate the global regulatory landscape, the extent to which they succeed depends on the availability of opportunity structures and the type of strategies that, that they are going to employ. And that's it. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sue. Okay, so on to our 4th and final paper, which is from Ang Lee, Rethinking Economic Globalization and Decent Work in Latin America. And Ang is coming to us from Colorado State University.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming to the SASE section. My name is Ang Lee. I'm a master's student in sociology at Colorado State University. So today's presentation is a summary of my working paper studying the impact of economic globalization on informal economy in Latin America. Next slide, please. So I was motivated because so far, despite decades of integration into global production networks, economic globalization has so far failed to facilitate decent work in Latin America. The case of Latin America stands out because Latin America has the highest ratio of informal economy among developing countries. On average, about 50% of all workers in Latin America works in informal sector. In smaller countries like Peru, as high as 70% of all workers work in informal sector. So this raises a very interesting theoretically and empirically question, asking us, wondering why does economic globalization fail to facilitate decent work in Latin America? Why it produces inconsistent results on labor formalization in contemporary Latin America? Next slide, please. So to address this issue, I primarily use the model raised by Yeone Mosley in 2010, what is called the model of integration. So this mostly used model of integration to study how multinational corporations impacts the government sector in South Asia. And I expand on her model to study how multinational corporations and the way southern supplier firms are integrated into a global value chain can impact the informal economy. So the model of integration can briefly be categorized into two basic categories. The first is subsidiary-based integration. So if a multinational corporation acquires a significant part of southern supplier firm to form a subsidiary-based relationship, the southern supplier firms are more likely to intimidate organizational practice of their parent in leading firms in the global north. And therefore, they tend to have better labor practice and protect labor rights better. And therefore, it will create more formal jobs. On the other hand, if the relationship between leading firms in the global north and the supplier firms in the global south are primarily a subcontracting-based integration, then southern supplier firms are more likely to violate labor rights in order to keep their labor costs low, and it generally will lead to worse labor practice, and it will produce more informal and precarious jobs. So in practice, because it's unlikely for us to get comprehensive data on the relationship between southern supplier firms and us, northern leading firm and a southern supplier firm, because there are so many different firms. So in practice, sociologists use foreign direct investment or FDI to measure subsidiary-based integration, and they used trade openness to measure subcontracting-based integration. So for those who are not familiar with trade openness is calculated by the total amount of import plus export divided by total GDP. So a higher value in trade openness means a certain country's economy is relied more on import and export. And next slide, please. So despite this compelling framework raised by Mosley in 2010, there are still some gaps in the literature, between the literature and the reality. One of the preeminent question is it is still produce some inconsistent empirical results. For example, in a recent 2021 study finds that there is no significant positive impacts of FDI on all developed countries, but there is significant negative impacts of manufacturing export to global north on labor rights and labor practice. So in this paper, I would like to contribute to the global value chain literature by addressing why mode of integration still produce inconsistent results on labor rights and labor practice in developed countries. My argument is that existing literature in the global value chain studies usually use aggregated FDI and trade data without considering of the nuance of different types of FDI and different types of exports. Next slide, please. So my framework in this paper is what I call a variety of global value chain integration. Essentially, I'm developing from a binomial model of mostly, which is based on subsidiary-based and subcontracting-based integration, to a multinomial model. In particular, because, like I said, the primary issue with existing literature in global value chain is that they all use, almost all of them use aggregated FDI data and trade data without taking considering the nuance of different types of DI. In Latin America, this is very problematic because a significant part of foreign direct investment in FDI in Latin America was resources-seeking FDI. So resource-seeking FDI, like in primary sector, in mining sector, the majority use of this investment was on equivalent and buying rights to access to natural resources. So it should either have no direct impact on employment because it's such a small market, or it's because primary investment was on equivalent instead of hiring more formal labor. On the other hand, in market-seeking and efficiency-seeking FDI, the market-seeking FDI was, the goal of market-seeking FDI was to expand local market in the southern firms. Therefore, we would expect this type of DI was negatively associated with informal because only with more formal employment we can increase the income of southern workers and therefore expand the southern local market. While the efficiency-seeking FDI was primarily concerned with lowering labor costs, therefore it should positively associate with informal employment. I also have a similar argument based on trade openness. I hypothesize that the export of capital-intensive products would negatively associated with informal employment, while export of labor-intensive product is positively associated with informal employment. Next slide, please. So in order to test my framework, I primarily use data from I use secondary source data from World Bank, ECLA, and ICT. The dependent variable I use is informal employment, is calculated by how much of workers in the urban sector was employed in the informal sector. The data was gathered from annual household survey conducted by individual Latin America countries and is aggregated by ECLA, which refers to Economic Commission for Latin America. And the independent variable I used was primary sector FDI and the trade openness gathered from ICT, International Trade Center, and World Bank, which is based on World Development Indicator. I use primary sector FDI to measure resources FDI because the majority of resources seeking FDI was indeed in primary sector, either in agricultural sector or in mining sector. I also add several other control variables like population growth, GDP per capita, educational, and the strength of national labor regulation as a measurement of institutional strengths. In terms of methods, I primarily use panel data analysis. So I construct an unbalanced panel consisting of 11 different Latin American countries. The time ranges from 2000 to 2019, the year before the pandemic, for a total of 96 observations. The panel data was still very limited because of the data about primary sector FDI is very limited in Latin America countries. So I will discuss that later. I use a fixed effect model because a simple Husman test shows that the fixed effect model was inconsistent with random effect model. Therefore, we should use fixed effect model because it's produced more consistent results. I also do several robustness checks in the background on RStudio, although I won't be able to show that to you today. Next slide, please. So this is my primary findings on the relationship between primary sector FDI and the informal employment. So the model 1 was a bivariated model, which we can see that primary sector FDI is significantly associated with informal employment in Latin America, and it actually has a positive impact on informal employment, which means 1 unit increase in primary sector FDI will cause 0.7 unit increase in informal employment based on a bivariated regression model. And from model 1 to model 2, I add net FDI as a control variable. So this is the most important finding from my study. We can see that primary sector FDI, when controlled by net FDI, has an even higher significant positive impact on informal employment. However, net FDI, when controlled by primary sector FDI, has a negative impact on informal employment. What it suggests is that existing literature on economic globalization usually assume that FDI, foreign direct investment, should reduce informal employment because it creates more job opportunities in developing countries. So my study does align with that. However, this is only true if we are talking about net FDI. This is not the case in primary sector FDI. Primary sector FDI actually increases informal employment, and which suggests that FDI in manufacturing sector and the service sector actually reduces informal employment when we take these two models together. And in model 3, I add the population as the control variable. It does not have an impact on informal employment. I was not be able to show you other control variables because the sample size was too small. And in terms of GDP per capita, the GDP per capita in Latin America is significantly associated with net FDI. In other words, if I add GDP per capita as a control variable, it will cause a statistics issue. So I have to remove it from the model for that for the time period. Next slide, please. So my second finding on trade openness is surprisingly, I find in model 1, a bivariated model between trade openness and informal employment. I actually find that trade openness has zero impact on informal employment. This is surprisingly because existing literature point out that trade openness should reduce informal employment in developing countries. But the data I find based on Latin America countries actually suggests that trade openness has zero impact on informal economy. And even if I add net FDI as the control variable, I still find that trade openness has zero impact on informal employment. The coefficient is just too small. It's 0.007, so it's practically zero. It has zero impact on informal employment. And even if I add more control variables like population, education, and GDP per capita, trade openness still has no impact on informal employment. So this raises some interesting interpretations. Although it defies my own hypothesis, so I could have some possible explanations on this. It could be because even if Latin America countries has more import and export with the rest of the world, it does not necessarily improve the position of Latin America countries in the global value chain. And it may even cause disarticulation of Latin America countries from the rest of the global value chain. And therefore, it will not necessarily produce more formal jobs in Latin America. Next slide, please. So the primary findings of my paper is that primary sector FDI has significantly positive impact on informal employment. The coefficient is very high at 1.1. The p-value was smaller than 0.01, while the net FDI has a slight negative impact on informal employment. The coefficient is minus 0.27. The p-value is smaller than 0.05. When we take these two conclusions together, we could suggest that primary sector, although net FDI has a slightly negative impact on informal economy, primary sector FDI has a significant positive impact on informal economy. Therefore, we can explain why FDI produced inconsistent results, because some countries, the FDI was almost all in primary sector. Therefore, this kind of FDI will not help elevate the issue of informal employment. It will actually produce more informal jobs. While in some other countries like Brazil and Mexico, which has a better share of manufacturing, and manufacturing, FDI in manufacturing sector will actually produce more formal jobs and reduce informal employment. So depending on what types of FDI in Latin American countries, it will indeed produce inconsistent results. On the other hand, when we turn to trade openness, my finding was that trade openness has no impact on informal employment. So at this stage, I can only speculate. It may be because trade openness does not improve the position of developing countries and may even cause adverse incorporations of Latin American countries into global value chain. My overall finding is that informal sector persists in Latin America because of the continuous domains of resource FDI. I do not find significant evidence about the effect of trade openness in this paper. Next slide, please. So I want to briefly discuss the contribution and the limitation of my paper. So my primary contribution is develop a new framework of the variety of GVC integration to account for the nuance of sector-level FDI and the trade specialization to expand cross-national variations in informal employment. And also the variety of global value chain integration framework can also be expanded to study other indicators of decent work, such as collective labor rights and the gender wage gap. For example, my advisor, Dr. Robles, was at this time using this framework to study the impact of informal economic globalization on income inequality in Latin America. And we actually find some very interesting findings. So for example, my finding is that foreign direct investment will reduce informal employment in Latin American countries, while my advisor finds that FDI does not have a direct impact on income inequality. So similarly, I find that the trade openness has no direct impact on informal employment, while my advisor finds that trade openness has a negative impact on income inequality in Latin America. It sounds contractive, but if you think it from a real world perspective, it's not actually conflicting. So for example, economic globalization could produce more formal jobs in Latin America, but it will not necessarily reduce income inequality. Actually, economic globalization will very much likely increase income inequality in globalization. Therefore, my hope is that my framework of this variety of GVC integration could be utilized to study other issues in the global value chain literature and developing countries in Latin America. The primary limitation of my study was data limitation, because sector-level FDI and input-output data are not widely available among Latin American countries. They are available for OECD countries. So if anyone was interested to use my framework to study OECD countries, you're very welcome to improve on my framework. And as for the future, as I'm currently revising the paper, I would like to do more robustness checks. So one way I can do is I would like to use ILO, International Labor Organization's estimate of informal employment. The ILO's database has more countries. It includes 179 countries, but it only starts collecting this data from 2017. So it has a smaller time frames. That's why it's not the best for this time of panel data model. However, they could use ILO's data as the references group could produce some very interesting points. For example, if we find that trade openness has a negative impact on informal employment in South Asia countries, but has zero impact on informal employment in Latin American countries, then we could point out that it's because Latin American countries have some special issues that somehow mitigate the impact of trade openness, while this is not the case in South Asia. And I would like to use in future revisions, I would like to use a mixed effect model in addition to fixed effect model to improve the results of my findings. Thank you.
Great.